These trousers are an essential wardrobe item with pockets for children's treasures, and a choice of lengths are given. They can look smart in a cotton drill or a casual denim, and they can behave in lightweight fabrics for summer and medium weights for winter. You need a front leg times 2, back leg times 2, a pocket outer times 2 on the grain, and a pocket under times 2, and a waistband 1 on the fold. Cutting the fabric. Lay your front down, pin it, and cut around it up to the edge of the pattern piece. Cut your curving areas as neatly as you possibly can. And make sure you put in your markings for the front crotch and for the pocket and along the waistband. And lay the back down, pin it to the fabric on the straight grain, and cut around that up to close up to the pattern piece, making sure you put the markings in and that the curve of the crotch is neat. And this is on the straight grain also. Put your markings in, hip, back, next thing you're going to cut out is the pocket bag and the pocket facing. These need to be on the straight grain, do them at the same time, pin them down and cut as closely as you can to the pattern piece edges, and put your marking notches in. Try and keep the curve on each of the pockets as precise as the pattern piece calls for, especially where the hand goes into the pocket. The sun must have been shining the day I did this. And make sure you put all those corresponding marks onto your fabric pieces. Waistband, 1 on a fold on a straight grain or across the grain, and make sure you put in the markings from the master pattern. And then we're going to cut an interfacing. First of all, I cut one side to get a nice clean line, and because you're only interfacing half the lengthwise, so as you can see we've just laid it so it's about half, and we only cut that slither of interfacing, which we go and iron to the inside part of the waistband, not the part that sits on the outside of the waist. Right, the first thing we're doing is the pockets. Taking a front leg with the right sides facing, we're going to pin a pocket facing piece to the corresponding front leg pattern piece, and we'll match the markings. Pin it in place, and we're going to sew it from the waist down to the side of the leg. So that means on one leg you'll pin on the pocket side and one leg you'll pin on the leg side. Because it's woven fabric, we're using straight stitch, and we don't need to neaten the seam because we're actually going to top stitch. So we've sewn the seam, and now we're going to clip every 1 centimetre to release the tension, and when we turn out the pocket, so we're going to turn the pocket facing to the wrong side and press it. So we're turning it over, and you can either press it first or pin it first, sew it and press it later, up to you. So we pin it down, and again we're going to top stitch this with the straight stitch. If you've got a coloured fabric like a nice denim, you could use maybe a cream colour as your top stitching thread to give it the jeans look. So, depending on whether you pressed it before you sewed, press it after you sew. Right, the next thing we're going to do is place the pocket bag to the pocket facing. So it's going to be right sides facing, and we're going to try and sew this one from the waist to the side seam as well. So you can see the pocket becoming what a pocket looks like. So we sew this seam with straight stitch, back stitch to begin, back stitch to end to secure it. We're going to clip it, and we're going to neaten the seam, and we're going to press it. And then we're going to pin the top of the pocket to the pant and the side of the pocket to the pant, and we're going to stay stitch it in place, which is the longest straight stitch length, and it just keeps it all together because you've got 3 layers there that could move when you're putting the waistband on. And with the side seam you've got 3 layers plus the other leg that could move around as well. Repeat this for the second leg front pocket. Side seams. We're going to lay a back leg and a front leg with right sides facing and pin them together and match the markings as we pin. Use as many pins as possible between the waist and the hem of the leg. So there we are, all ready to sew. A close-up of the pocket. And we're going to use straight stitch and carefully sew from the waist to the cuff of the pant. Careful over all those layers, and when we're finished we can pull out the stay stitching threads on the side seam by the pockets and do this for both legs. And then we're going to top stitch the seam with a twin needle. Means you don't have to neaten it. If you don't have a twin needle, neaten it first and use a single stitch line. Press the seam on both sides. Inner leg seam. With right sides facing, we're pinning the inner leg seam of a front to a back. Start at the crotch and at the leg cuff and pin in between. And then we can either sew the seam from the crotch to the hem or from the hem to the crotch, your choice. Back stitch to begin and end your seam, and then we have to neaten it with zigzag stitch. And this seam gets pressed towards the back pattern piece of the trouser leg. Crotch. We need to turn one leg right side out and slip this inside the other leg, which will be the wrong side out. With those right sides facing, we're going to pin the 2 legs together at the front and the back waist, the crotch and the markings. Once you've pinned these, pin in between. I like to start with the crotch first because it's the main seam. And we're all ready to sew. We're going to sew this seam with straight stitch, and because it's a curved seam, take your time and you'll get the best look in the end. Sew this seam from the front waist to the back waist. When you're finished, trim your threads, clip and neaten the seam to increase the strength. So neatening the seam with a zigzag, straighten it out a little bit. You can see here the cuts are open a bit, just helps with that movement in the crotch. And then press it to one side. This is our, looks like our little turkey on the tailor's hem. Make sure you don't burn your hand, and you're ready for the waistband. Okay, we're onto the waistband now. First thing we have to do is iron on or sew in the interfacing. It's only on one half of the lengthwise waistband, so if we're ironing it on, we do so, and then we can fold it in half. The half of the waistband that doesn't have interfacing is on the outside, on the right side of the garment, and the interfacing piece is on the wrong side, on the inside of the garment. First thing we have to do is sew the loop together, and we do that with straight stitch, back stitch, and at the beginning and the end to secure your seam. You can press that seam open, and then we're going to attach it to the pants at the waist. So you need to make sure that the side that doesn't have interfacing is being pinned to the pants. So start at the waistband centre back with the seam of the waistband to the pant back centre seam, and pin all the way around. Use lots of pins so that you don't have any mishaps when sewing. And we're going to sew this on with straight stitch, back stitch to begin with. Start at the centre back and sew around to the centre front and back to the centre back. And we're not going to neaten this seam because we're going to fold the waistband over, put elastic in there and top stitch it down. We will neaten the outside edge of the waistband, unless you're using twin needle, and it will do it at the same time. So at the moment I'm neatening the outside of the waistband, and that zigzag all the way round, and trim your threads. So we're going to press the waist seam, and we're pressing it up towards the waistband on both sides, and look nice and crisp. And the next thing we're doing is we're going to sew our elastic into a circle, a loop. So we find the right measurement of elastic to fit snugly around your child's waist, and add 2 centimetres for the overlapping seam. Overlap the elastic by 1 centimetre and sew. I sew with zigzag on elastic so that it can move. And then you're going to loop the elastic over the trousers and tuck it in the gap between the seam you've sewn to sew the waistband to the pant and the waistband. It just kind of gives it a little kind of half a casing, and fold your waistband over this elastic and pin on the right side. You're going to attach the waistband to the trousers using the stitch in the ditch technique. Look at that in the glossary. Otherwise you can use the twin needle if you haven't neatened your waistband and you want to neaten it all in one go. So pin all the way around. Use as many pins as possible so that you're not going to have any errors. And sew with the chosen top stitch. So stitch in the ditch is where you're actually sewing into the seam of the waistband attached to the trousers, so it almost disappears and you don't see it. If you use twin needle you will see it. So here we've got stitch in the ditch happening now. I've got a special foot for it that's got kind of like a metal bar that sits in the seam ridge. You can see it, but it actually kind of sneaks and hides away and looks really tidy. And when you're finished, press the waistband from the wrong side. Hems. 2 ways you can do this. You can zigzag stitch and neaten your hem and do a single line of top stitching, straight stitch, or you can pin your hem and sew it with twin needle, and it does the zigzag underneath and the top stitching on top. So fold a 1.5 centimetre hem to the wrong side and pin it all the way around, and then top stitch your preferred method. Love that twin needle, just makes things so much more efficient. Trim your fabric, excess fabric, and press from the wrong side. Finished.